Okay, thank you, David, and thank you very much for having us today. So, I mean, we are glad to present together with Leo. So this is something that we really wanted to do. This is the second time we present this paper called Intellectual Monopoly and the Drug Innovation Puzzle. It is a study on the process of externalization of FDA-approved drugs, basically the last decades. So what you're going to see is that basically what we did with Leo was trying to build a new database, and this paper is basically the preliminary results that we had from the database. And within the discussion, we're gonna try to go a little bit further, and we're gonna try to say some new stuff that we didn't actually said publicly right now. So Leonard, I mean, you already did the presentation. We can go. Maybe I can start to present a little bit the. Oh, whoa. Okay, so why this subject and the actuality of the pharmaceutical sector? So maybe you have seen the actuality between the news between that kind of power play that the Trump administration, the US administration have done with the pharmaceutical sector. What is this power play about? It's an old school question. It's every time about drug price. You have to know that the drug price within the US market, all the drug prices are very high. It's a completely free market, liberalized market. So actually the price of the drug within the US market are way higher than in the other countries. And all this power play was about doing something that the kind of the defense industry already did. It was trying to push pressure on the other European country in a way to increase their drug price. And this was backed up by the pharmaceutical industry, because the big political narrative of the pharmaceutical industry from decades now was actually to say that they need very high prices in a way to recoup the R&D costs. And this is, when I say this is a political narrative, it is to say that basically those costs are not just the result of the free market and the magical free market. It's actually something that the pharmaceutical industry did try to push, and to say basically we have a very lengthy way of producing an innovation. It's very heavy in terms of capital investment, and so now with the prices we need to recoup that investment. And the real problem that we have here is that this cornerstone is actually a blind spot for researcher, for the literature, because we actually don't have data on this. And the data we have, it's basically data coming from directly from the industry, and so this is a huge blind spot within a political battlefield that we have to tackle. And I put this this quote from Médecins Sans Frontières, saying that now this narrative needs to be tackled, and we cannot actually let the narrative of the of the pharmaceutical sector being the dominant one. Just few articles I put also to just say that basically this is not something new. You have this very good article from Sabine Pitlou and Pierre-Yves Donzé saying basically that European company actually were already doing that back then, already in the 1970s, always trying to say, okay, you need to pay a high price for our drug in a way that we can still continue to spend on R&D and to a flow of R&D capitals. So with Leo, what we did try to say is actually we want to tackle this question, and we want to actually understand what is the real effort, the real impact of the real effort of the pharmaceutical sector, the big pharma, within the process of the innovation, the process of producing a new innovation, a new drug. So we started by thinking that we don't want to tackle only on the data, the raw data. We want to tackle by this idea that now big pharma push for externalization. They actually don't really do all the work. They try to make the work done by other companies. So this is what we're going to present today. I let Leo showing the map of the sector.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, maybe first of all, I think the term big pharma is kind of a common sense term. We understand, or most of the people kind of have an idea of what this means. Specifically, you saw it in the first slide that Jimmy presented. We have these companies that we know, like Pfizer and others. But actually, having a little bit of a look in the data. First of all, if we take a look on the revenue development of the pharmaceutical sector, here we're taking together biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. We can maybe enter later in a discussion why this might be important for the future. But if we look at the revenue distribution, we see that the pharmaceutical sector has also, due to increasing spending on healthcare within specifically the US, but also in European economies, has magnificently gained relevance, and total revenue reaches in 2024, 2020, up to $1.5 billion. And what is actually then quite interesting, and then coming to this notion of big pharma, we talk about an industry where we have around 2,000 companies in 2024. However, if we take a look, and here in the red line, if we take a look on the biggest 30 companies, we see that their share is already $1 billion, and $1 trillion, sorry, 1 trillion, which kind of corresponds to 70% of the revenue share of the industry. So 30 against 2,000, and they obtain 70% of the revenue. So we have this high concentration of revenue within these like big corporations. And if we take a look a bit more detail on the world map, we see that there's a certain concentration of these companies in the global north. This has, of course, also a historical part of it, because the pharmaceutical industry developed specifically at the beginning in the European countries and then in the US. And I mean, you all know some of these companies. Specific Pfizer is known for the vaccines, but also there's these new upcoming biotechnology companies in the US that have reached also big pharma status. And in general, we find this high concentration in the US and in Europe, while the global south is practically not existent in this map. So if we take a look on something else rather than revenue, which might be very interesting, it is profits. And if we take a look on the profitability of the pharmaceutical industry, we find that the pharmaceutical industry is extremely profitable compared to other industries. And here, this is the study of Ledley et al. From 2020, where they compare the average profitability of the pharmaceutical industry with other S&P 500 industries. And what they find is, in the first line up there, concerning gross profits, that the pharmaceutical industry obtains a higher share of profit compared to other industries. In terms of EBIT, or earnings before income, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, this is also persistent, as well as net income. This is, of course, linked, and we're going to talk a bit more deeper about this on this like patent architecture that will be also relevant in the assessment of our study. But this profit picture is actually a bit of a different picture if we take a deeper look within the industry. And I think this is kind of also an importance when doing industrial economics, because taking always aggregates of industries doesn't often tell us a full picture of what we're seeing. So when we actually take a look on the pharmaceutical industry, we see that there has been a falling rate of profit, or profit margin. However, this is not true for Big Pharma. Big Pharma has obtained a steady profit rate and has also increased since the 1990s. The same holds as well for the top companies, but specifically the mid 50 to 80% have obtained declining rates of profit. And this is specifically due to one fact within the pharmaceutical industry, and you can also see that specifically with this decline of the mid companies, we actually find that a lot of companies within the pharmaceutical industry, and these are public companies, so they had an IPO, so they have been brought to the financial markets and investors invested in these companies. However, a lot of companies, and here's 600, so around like 45%, have actually no revenue. So these companies exist without a product, which will be important for our analysis and the understanding of this industry. And coming back to what Jimmy said, there is a certain problem for these pharmaceutical companies concerning the growing and constant innovation of new products. So here you have an article from the Financial Times, and here they assessed that actually there is something that is called a patent cliff. We're going to dig a bit deeper what this means, but the pharmaceutical industry is under constant pressure to bring new drugs to the market, while constantly facing the fear of losing the patents and losing the drugs that are currently existing in their portfolio. And this can make up to hundreds of billions of dollars every year that get lost for this industry. So the pharmaceutical industry, specifically Big Pharma, has been extremely dependent on mergers and acquisitions. And this is just a snapshot. If you take a look on these Big Pharma companies, they have multiple acquisitions every year that range from smaller sized acquisitions to huge mergers, depending on gaining market concentration, gaining market capitalization, or gaining new products in the portfolio. So when we actually take a look on the dependence on acquisitions and compare it to the R&D expenditures that these companies have, here I introduced also capital expenditures. So basically capital expenditures and R&D expenditures together is like basically the internal innovation capacity of these companies. And if you ignore the outlier here in 1995, that's fine, you can actually see that there has been a growing trend of acquisitions within the industry. And specifically since 2005, 2006, there is also these like constant acquisitions. So they don't happen as with other companies that you have sometimes a merger and then 5 years nothing happens. Since 2005, these acquisitions occur regularly within the industry. And if we look at Big Pharma and the top companies, they have been also increasing and reaching sometimes up to par compared to the internal innovation capacities of these companies. So this shows this high dependence on mergers and acquisitions for these companies. But also we're going to take a little bit of a step back, because I think one of the most important thing is to understand drug innovation. And this is basically very much linked to these mergers and acquisition regimes. And drug innovation, so bringing a product to the market in the pharmaceutical industry, is something completely different than in other industries. I mean, it's not like a new Nike shoe that most likely just needs an innovation of like half a year and advertisement. Actually, drugs need and require a long innovation process to be actually brought to the market. So, and here, this is even, we're starting here with drug discovery, but before you actually have a longer step as well that takes place in universities on actually identifying chemicals, identifying biological entities. But when we start from the drug discovery process, we actually have a multifaceted development and research phase, where in the preclinical phase, which is the first phase, it is the testing of molecules and see the reactionary capacities of the identified products. And then after 5 years, so this takes already 5 years of development, then actually a compound, which is not yet a drug, enters the clinical development phase, where on human trials, we have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And these phases are getting more and more intensified over the course, meaning phase 1 is often with a lower number of patients, phase 2 more patients, and then phase 3 is the big trials that then end the development phase, and then drugs get market authorized. Often the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, is often the first place where this happens. So the US is always kind of our center point when we look at medications, and then often administration happens in other countries. Specifically, drug trials are often designed in a way that suits the approval of the FDA, because, for example, the European Medical Agency, if a drug is already FDA acquired, you don't need to do that much more for the European authorization, because they kind of accept the FDA standard. So until the drug actually then comes to market, it takes up to 15 years of development until this actually has been an authorized product, which also explains why we have so many companies that are without revenue and without products, because this work has to be done. And then, which is the most important part on the commercialization side, a drug enters the market. And during that time, due to patents such as the TRIPS agreements, treaties on the rights of intellectual property, and laws such as the Bayh-Dole Act in the US, the Hatch-Waxman, the Orphan Drug Act, these regulations give the opportunity for these companies to have a market exclusivity period, which means they have the monopoly on these drugs, and as long as they have this monopoly, they can dictate the prices, And here it comes also, of course, into question, as Jimmy presented, usually to recoup their R&D investments. However, this monopoly is granted without knowing the costs of R&D, so companies can use this monopoly also to increase prices not based on R&D costs. And then this period can also be extended up to 5 more years, and then generic competition enters, and with generic competition entering this place, prices usually fall up to 80%. So the drugs become often quite, in an economic sense, relatively useless for these companies anymore, as they are not the revenue drivers anymore for these companies. And how does this look? I mean, you all theoretically know acetaminophen. It's one of the most important drugs that have been ever developed. Tylenol, for example, is the original drug that has been marketed in the US, had this exclusivity period. And then when the generic competition arrives, for the Latin Americans, Tafirol, for example, for everyone that got sick or is French, got sick here or is French, it's Doliprane, that we all can easily buy in a pharmacy. And there you also see that these drugs often have a relatively low price, so they can be, like, they're not that costly. So what we basically did, and in order to stay in line with this drug innovation picture, we can draw 3 distinct phases within this innovation process. The first one is the preclinical and the research phase. So the drug is not yet developed. It is a compound. It is a molecule that has a certain chemical or biological reaction. Then we have the development phase, where human trials are starting, and actually a compound becomes a drug and is tested on patients. And as well, then the commercialization phase, where development has been closed and the drug as a product, as a brand, is on the market. So the question is, as we're seeing this phase up to 25, 30 years, the question is here, is this only done by one corporation? Is this only done by one entity? Because this is a long phase, and of course, as you already have seen some data, there is some questions on why would someone do all of this process just by themselves. So our question in general for conducting our study was, who is the real innovator of these drugs? As you also saw, there's so many M&A deals, there's most likely a switch in the ownership. And specifically asking the question, as you saw the profit distributions and the revenue distributions, what is the contribution of Big Pharma specifically in this innovation process that leads to this high profitability of the big corporations? So what we did was we looked at 448 drugs that have been approved by the FDA from 2010 to 2020. And this built basically our full set of the analysis. We had to cut this analysis a bit down because we need 2 important entry points, which is the switches between the phases. So the switch between the research phase to the drug development phase is identified by an IND. An IND is an application that is sent to the FDA, and it is an investigational new drug. So it's the confirmation that your research phase has led to certain identification of a compound, and now the switch towards drug development. And then we have also the administration by the Food and Drug Administration. We had to cut, of course, the drugs out where we don't have identified an IND. And we also had to cut diagnostic products out. Diagnostic products are used in order to diagnose certain parts, but they're not necessarily drugs. So they're not active compounds against a certain disease. So this is all already relatively a complex picture. Another problem that enters in this industry is actually also different indications. And as you saw already in the slide before, we have only focused on one indication. But just to give you a little bit of an example and a little bit of understanding, who knows the drug semaglutide? The beauty is you all know it. Do you know Rybelsus? Have you ever heard that? Most likely not. Have you ever heard of Ozempic? Yeah. Exactly. So this also shows already the difficulty in here. What is Ozempic prescribed for? Diabetes? Exactly. Often people think it's obesity because, you know, we have all of these I love Ozempic shirts, we have here in the news, politicians, Elon Musk getting treated with Ozempic, but it's actually not. It is a diabetes medication. And if we actually take a look on the drug semaglutide, we see that the same drug is marketed in 3 different ways. There's the 2 diabetes indications. Ozempic was the first one, which is injectable, and then Rybelsus has been put on the market as an oral use. But then the obesity drug that has been launched is actually Wegovy, and you have different formulations on these drugs, so a drug can be used on very different, often different diseases. And specifically, this drug is interesting because the research on these are GLP-1 inhibitors, is actually decades old. It comes from the 1990s, and the first drug that had these receptors was already in the market in the 2000s. However, Novo Nordisk did clinical trials, and specifically on Ozempic, where they found that actually there has been, in the patient groups, a significant reduction of weight while they were diabetic. So this is only the reason why actually then Wegovy came to the market. So this drug innovation in these multiple phases is also multiplied over and over again by these corporations in order to test for new indications, but this would make our analysis, as we want to present a simple model, way too complex, and so we cut this out. So in this sense, for example, our analysis would only rely on Ozempic. So coming back to the creation of a database that is already simplified but still relatively complex, because we relied on a bunch of sources to actually develop the data that we required. So we have from the FDA the approval dates, which is relatively easy, it's just a simple download. We have the IND dates from a specific paper of Brown et al., and we get the originator of each drug, so the company that has actually launched this drug in the research phase from Addis Insight database. And then we used corporate and company financial data because we wanted to understand who owns this drug in which specific phase. I'm going to show that after as well. And so we required ownership data, where we used a bunch of databases such as BioCentury, but we also digged carefully in annual corporate reports, corporate press releases, in order to understand who holds a drug in a specific time. So how does this look? So we start with the originator, which is the first actor in our database that we find. And then in the research and pre-IND phase, where the drug is basically only a compound, we assess if the originator is still the owner of this specific drug. And then we assess if the originator is actually not owning this drug in this phase, if there was a licensing, acquisition, or collaboration agreement that has transferred this drug to a new owner. And then as the IND is marked, we know when the phase is switching to development, and we do basically the same. So we assess, is the originator still here? Is the previous owner from the previous phase still here? Has there been a license? Has there been an acquisition? And is there a new owner? And we repeat this, of course, for the commercialization phase. So what we come up with is a relatively simple model, where in each of the phases, we can assess if the drug is in internal research, which means the drug is still with the originator. If the drug is in a collaborative research, which means, and you have this quite often in the pharmaceutical industry, that multiple companies work together on one drug, because let's imagine you have a biotech that is very research-driven. They might lack money and funding. As we saw, they have no revenue. But for example, you have a big pharma corporation with a lot of money potential, but also the connection towards the hospitals to conduct clinical trials. This is a perfect match for them to work together. And we have in red the externally sourced category, which means that in this phase, the drug has actually been transferred from the original originator of the drug towards another entity. I hope so far so clear. And then we just add another layer, and as we do big pharma studies, we try to assess here who is the owner, not only in terms of which company it is, but actually what type of company it is, or actor. And we distinguish between two types of actors. We say there's a periphery in this whole concept, and the periphery are academic institutions, government institutions, private small and medium-sized enterprises, and for example, non-profits. Or is the drug actually within a large biopharma company, which are these top corporations that I presented before, and I mean, we also refer to as big pharma. So just to give you a simple example on how this would look on one specific drug, I mean, we did this for 371, but here the case of Sovaldi, it's a very, very interesting case. There's a paper by Roy and Mazzucato, no, Roy definitely, but also Roy and Mazzucato addressed this in their paper. It's a Hep C, hepatitis C drug, and it has created one of the biggest scandals in like the newer history concerning drug pricing. And it also relates very much to this idea of recouping R&D costs with high drug prices, or actually using this money to pay out shareholders, for example. So when we look at Sovaldi, we see that in the preclinical phase, Sovaldi is actually with the periphery, as it has been originated by Pharmasset. However, I'm just going to admit this. However, there has been an acquisition. Specifically in 2011, Pharmasset has been acquired, and the acquisition was done by Gilead. And in this case then, Gilead is a large pharmaceutical company. It goes into our category of big pharma. So we find that as there was an acquisition, the originator is not present anymore. The drug is now externally sourced by Gilead in the development phase. And consequently, as Gilead kept the drug, did the last trials, and then brought it to market, it also rests with Gilead in the last phase, in the commercialization phase.
Okay, so when we run actually the code, this is what we are looking for, this is what we find. So basically what you just see here is, well, a very well organized mess, and you have actually a lot of possibility for a drug to be combined, to go through the periphery, the big pharma, being externalized, be internal, etc., etc. What you want to focus on is basically, if I just do a quick reminder, here's the green line are the internal line. So basically, when I was saying, okay, a big company, when they say, okay, I need to, sorry, yeah, maybe speaking too close of it. When they say, okay, I need to recoup my R&D because actually I handle almost everything, the political narrative of big pharma is this green line. You have the extreme opposite, which is basically the externalization process of the innovation, which are all the red line, and you have kind of something like a bit hybrid, which is the collaborative side. And what when we are getting closer of those lines, what we are basically seeing when we are actually interested in what big pharma refers when they talk about producing a drug is actually this pathway. And in terms of weight, so we find that this pathway only occur 12% of the time on our entire data set. So it's only 51 drugs that are actually produced, originated, developed, and commercialized by big pharma. So the big narrative saying that big pharma actually, this route is the dominant one, is the hegemonic one, is actually, whenever you're going to read that in the newspaper or in the political statement, you have to remember that this is now actually became completely marginal. What we have then, so when we actually focus on the externally sourced route, so what we basically see is that it became the main and the dominant way of producing a drug, of producing a new innovation, and you have multiple pathways to do so. There is some very interesting one. For example, you have this line here, which is basically one peripheral unit that discover the drug, develop the drug, but whenever the drug is developed, developed, it's already on the market, it is acquired. So we refer that as a late acquisition, which is basically big pharma acquiring an innovation already able to be sold without risk. There is another one, for example, which is this one, which is almost the same. This is a big pharma acquiring a drug when it's already on the market, but what you see is that there is a fragmentation of the road, which means that within the externalization process, you have a phenomenon of fragmentation. So you have you have many roads that you can actually see within this, but basically what you see is that big pharma source most of their innovation and most of the drug during the development process. So we find that almost 140 almost 40% of the drug commercialized by big pharma are actually externally sourced or follow the route of externally sourced drug. And last but not least, which is the collaboratively produced drug, which hold for 11%. So it's not completely an external process, but this is basically a way to dilute the cost of producing a drug. It's a way to actually share the cost with another entity and share the risk with another entity, and it actually is quite still significant. When we try to recap a little bit the result we have, we have to read those numbers like this. The entire drug hold by big pharma is actually 228, which means that 61% of every drug on the market are held by big pharma. So it means that there is some drugs that actually big pharma is not interested in, but we won't discuss about this the differences between the drug they hold. We can do that in the discussion maybe. And in square bracket, what you have is actually what are the different productive strategy, the sourcing strategy for every pipeline for big pharma. You can understand those numbers as a big aggregate pipeline for every big pharma. So all those drugs have been sourced by a big pharma somehow. And what we can see, I think this number is the most important, the most important number, is that basically when we take all the pipelines from big pharma, 62% of those drugs were completely externally sourced. And when we add the collaboratively produced drug, we almost arrived to 80% of a process of drug being externalized within the pipeline of big pharma. So this is the main result we got. So then we have obviously need to discuss them in the light of the political economy question. So I think our first empirical result is that we kind of confirm the idea that the industry now is completely fragmented and there is a high degree of innovation outsourcing. This is something that was known within the business sector, but the intensity of that phenomenon was actually quite unknown. And something so I think the first point is to say now the classic model of a vertically integrated in-house R&D process within big pharma now have become a clear minority case, and it's not the dominant way of producing an innovation. Second point, also important, is that now the contribution of peripheral actor goes way behind the early stages. In the literature back then, the position of some peripheral actor was actually acknowledged, but it was only for basic research, fundamental research. Now what we are seeing in this database is that those peripheral units actually participate actively in the development stage, and sometimes very lately, very advanced phases during development. And obviously, this is the opposite. Big pharma, large pharmaceutical firms, mainly concentrated now on late-stage acquisition, and sometimes, as I was saying, innovation already on the market, already marketable. And I think there is two points that we have to make in a way to discuss with the literature. I think there is two notions very important here. One notion of Raffol in a paper in 2014, the technical notion. Now Big Pharma is not only vertical lab, it's a network integrator. So now the purpose of Big Pharma is actually to integrate many peripheral firms, many innovation exterior of its own frontier. And I think there is another notion more into political economy. Obviously, you all know the notion of the work of Cecilia Recap now, the notion of intellectual monopoly, who I think they provide us a very relevant analytical tool. Maybe just to do a reminder, the notion of intellectual monopoly is the capacity for big firm to increase the frontier, the technological frontier, with the other peripheral actor by predation of their knowledge capacity, basically. Second empirical result that we have is that we have to think the two dynamics of innovation fragmentation and market concentration. It's not two opposite phenomenon. You can have a hyper-specialization in core activity from big pharma, from big companies, but in the other hand, you can have an expansion of production attributable to the periphery. It means that you can have an expansion of the number of firms doing the innovation, and on the other hand, having a very concentrated industry. So obviously, those results that we have is just the first one, and it lays the ground somehow with for further research in terms of how big pharma actually can make strategic planning in their sector. So this is it. It was the database. It was what we actually wrote, and now we do try to go a little bit further. So what do we have in our database? Basically, we have companies, we have phases, we have switches, but most important, we have days. We have the moment when the company is originated, and we have the moment the company is put on the market. And so the question is not only how many transfer big pharma in the periphery have been done, it's also when does exactly big pharma enter during this innovation process. And what we can find actually here, so here on the graph you have exactly the same framework as before. You have here the IND dates, so the moment where a drug comes from preclinical to clinical. So here you have the development phase, and here in the green dots you have the FDA approved, so it's when it goes into the market. And in the blue dots you have acquisition by big pharma, licensing by big pharma. It is when big pharma actually enter into the market to get these drugs. And so how can we answer this question? Basically, when does big pharma enter during the production? We could say right in the middle. If we want to be really precise, it would be a little bit later than the middle of the journey. So last step to do if we really want to go as deep as possible. So we have days, and now we have the proportion that a drug is being held by the periphery and by big pharma. So now all the work is trying to put a value per day in a way to see what is the average weight between the periphery and big pharma in terms of cost, in terms of value production. So what we did is actually found a report from the Tuft Center, which is a center very close to the pharmaceutical industry, and they try actually to see how much it cost. It was about some regulation, how much it cost for the pharmaceutical sector 1 day of regulating more the drug, and so they give us some number. It's very rare to have some number, so we play their game and we use their number, and so we can then put a value number on every day that we have during this development process. And what we can find then, we have days, we have value, and then we put those value within the framework of how to measure the cost of developing a drug. Sorry. So what you have here is, you have to read the graph like this. You have here the direct cost, which is basically what you found, the founding of a clinical trial. This is the direct money that you put within the production. Here you have the risk-adjusted cost, which is basically because clinical trials are very risky and you have a lot of termination, you have to actually weight the cost by all the other failures that you had before. And then you have this very specific, but if you did some finance or some economy, this the cost of capital, which is the opportunity cost that it costs for you to spend $1 in the production process and not somewhere else. So this is the cost of capital. This is the cost of the investment. And what you have here in blue, so this is big pharma participation, and in gray, this is the peripheral actor participation. And what you see is that obviously you have an increase in the total cost of a clinical trial, but you have a decreased proportionate participation of big pharma within those section. So what is interesting is that basically they are already able to fund not only half of the trial, the direct trial, but they found trial with a less proportion of risk to be terminated or to fail. And when we add the cost of capital, actually, what it means is that the investment they are doing, they're actually very delayed. They are doing the investment in a way that they can recoup this investment in a very short period. So what are the big capacity for big pharma? What is the new accumulation process of big pharma? What is it based on? It is based basically on big pharma capacity to be involved only partially. So this is the first one. Its capacity to externalize basically the productive risk to the others, and last but not least, the capacity to delay the timing of its own productive investment. Okay, so I think this is some new data here. We have to work on them a little bit, but this is some new a new contribution to the literature. Now the question is, what about the periphery? Basically, what you can say is, why does the periphery basically accept to sell their work on a non-proportionate fair, in a non-fair share? And actually, this is a good question. So I think with Leo we have two ways of thinking this contradiction. The first one is that peripheral units actually cannot, in the long run, secure a fair value share of their work, of their value production. So we are basically in the framework of intellectual monopoly as a way of value predation. Value predation. This is what Cecilia is doing, for example, and it is possible, I think, mainly because the target of those companies are pre-capitalist, non-capitalist, mixed, pre-capitalist, mixed capitalist entities. We think about public entities, research center, academia, non-profits, which are actually unable to access a fair share to their work and to the profit that they actually try to produce. And you have other ways to do that, obviously, with public subsidization, tax credit, etc., etc. So you have the notion of predation here that mainly concern the monopoly. And then you have the second path, which is how the moment where peripheral units actually can, in the long run, secure a fair value share of their work, and then you are here in a process of intellectual monopolization, but as a production of peripheral industrialization. So now the periphery is not just being predated, it is being industrialized, and because there is an industrialization, there is private capital going there, and those private capital actually do want a fair share of the surplus value they are producing, a fair share of their profit. So you have actually potential core periphery competition over surplus value. And right now we don't see exactly how it is going, how it will go, but there is some indication. For example, we can see now that the price of acquisition has been completely inflated. So this is an indication that now actually startups, private capital, they actually do want a bigger share of their work they were doing. And obviously, if you have an increase of price of the acquisition, you will have an increased price on the market, and at the end on the consumer and on the patients. So this is, I think, the both way of seeing how the dynamics will go. And just to bring the conclusion, because I think now we are good with 45 minutes. So basically, outsourcing of innovation is now something that does not lie in the air. It is a quantifiable phenomenon. We can show it. We have a good grain with this database, and the main point is to say that by reducing its productive involvement, actually big pharma, and managing obviously what will be brought to the market, so in a way reducing their cost and increasing the value capture, in the long run, they bring new contradiction in the model, and those contradiction for capital accumulation is something that now we have to get to know. Okay, and at the end, maybe just to conclude, the monopoly power, we can define monopoly power in this perspective of being able to strategically handling those contradictions between cost of production and value capture, and this is it. Thank you.